Once again, thank you for joining this Criterion Edge webinar. For those of you that are not already aware, Criterion Edge is a distinguished global provider in the medical device industry and pharmaceutical industry dedicated to helping clients advance compliance and enhance market success through expert regulatory, scientific, and clinical writing services. Our webinar today is entitled The Role of Real-World Evidence in Regulatory Submissions, presented by Dr. Sheila Grab. Dr. Sheila Grab is a Principal Writer 3 at Criterion Edge, where she specializes in navigating complex regulatory environments for pharmaceutical companies. With a robust educational background, including a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Pittsburgh, Sheila brings over a decade of experience in clinical research and scientific writing. Her expertise spans preclinical, clinical, and translational research across multiple therapeutic areas, and is experienced in developing clinical trial strategies and regulatory documentation. Sheila's deep understanding of the regulatory process and commitment to excellence make her an invaluable resource to clients striving for success in the pharmaceutical landscape. Now I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Sheila for today's presentation.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm very excited to talk to you all today about kind of one of the really hot topics right now, which is the real-world data and then the analysis of real-world data for real-world evidence. So what we're going to discuss today is the strategic use of real-world evidence throughout product development. We hope that you'll learn about how real-world evidence is integrated from various sources and how it can be used to bolster regulatory submissions. I hope that everyone today walks away with a better understanding of real-world data, which are used to generate real-world evidence. I like to explore the main uses of the evidence through this development process, and we'll also discuss some of the overall strength and pitfalls when using real-world evidence in regulatory submissions. So we have a lot to cover, but we can go to the next slide and kind of just jump in right now. So I know that we said we would get to questions at the end, but we had a question come in during registration about how often real-world evidence is used in regulatory submissions. So we thought it would be a good starting point to provide just some general context for our webinar today. So the FDA has committed to reporting aggregate and anonymized information on submissions to CBER, so the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, so the submissions that contain real-world evidence. And so there's data that exists from 2023 that I'm just going to start off with here. So in that time period, there were 10 submissions containing real-world evidence to CDER and 4 submissions containing real-world evidence to CBER. The primary focus of all 14 of these submissions was product safety, with the primary regulatory purpose being to fulfill either a post-marketing requirement or post-marketing commitments. The different data sources that were used in these submissions came from electronic health records, medical claims data, and registries, and all of the studies were non-interventional. So they were observational studies. The FD notes that will continue to report on this type of data so that they will provide transparency and insights into how it's being utilized to support safety and effectiveness of drugs and biologics. I think this is a really unique opportunity to track the progress of submissions and see how each year the number of submissions is changing, but also the type of data being used. I think that is going to continue to evolve, and the focus of the submissions. So right now, mainly in the post-market phase, but I think in the next few years, we'll see a shift to how this data is being used. All right, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so real-world evidence versus real-world data. So these are our two key terms. And what I have found is that they are being used inconsistently and sometimes interchangeably. You'll even see RWD/RWE when really one or the other should be used. So if you walk away with nothing else today, I really hope that if someone asks you what's the difference between real-world data and real-world evidence, you're able to convey, what each of these statements mean. So according to the FDA and its framework for the real-world evidence program, real-world data are the data relating to patient health status and/or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And some examples of real-world data are the data derived from electronic health records, medical claims data, and data from product or disease registries, and gathered from other sources that inform on the health status. So real-world evidence is the clinical evidence about the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from the analysis of real-world data. So in short, real-world data forms the basis for real-world evidence, and it can be extracted from a very broad range of sources. So, even simpler, the analysis of real-world data is what generates real-world evidence. So right now, like I said, this is kind of a hot topic, and there's a lot of buzz around both real-world data and real-world evidence. However, real-world data has existed, but with the advancement of access to electronic data, the data from these sources is becoming much more relevant in clinical research. So when you think about it, companies have been collecting post-market data as part of pharmacovigilance methods, but the industry is growing and expanding. And the databases that exist are now being harnessed to provide real-world evidence for regulatory submission. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. Great, thanks. So as you can see from this slide, the definitions of real-world data and real-world evidence are relatively consistent between some key regulatory agencies. So we've already discussed how the FDA defines real-world data and real-world evidence. And remember, the analysis of real-world data generates real-world evidence. But the European Medicines Agency, EMA, has defined real-world data as healthcare-related data that is collected outside of randomized clinical trials. And the real-world evidence is evidence coming from registries, electronic health records, and insurance data. So the Pharmaceuticals and Medical Device Agency from Japan has defined real-world data as data that is electronically generated and stored by medical institutions, but they have not yet given an official definition of real-world evidence. And so as real-world data and evidence use continues to increase, standardization and alignment across regulatory agencies and within guidance documents will improve the overall regulatory process. We can go to the next slide, and I would just like to introduce some additional, we can just move on to the next slide. There we go, thanks. I'd like to introduce some other terms that are relevant within the landscape of real-world evidence generation from real-world data. And these are fit-for-purpose data. So that means that the data are reliable and relevant to the regulatory research question. So this implies that data meet a standard before establishing that the data and the resulting analysis of it can be successfully used to inform regulatory decision-making. And very closely related are the data reliability. So this considers whether the data are adequately representing the underlying medical concepts that they are intended to represent. So, to state, data reliability addresses whether the data are trustworthy and credible. Data relevance is the assessment of whether the data can adequately address the regulatory question in part or in whole. So in other words, not using a non-relevant database to answer a question of the current disease state. So not using an Alzheimer's database to answer a question about breast cancer. So these are very key terms, and I want to make sure that we're all aware of them because they're used continuously to assess the overall quality of real-world data. So to track the process and status of real-world data and real-world evidence and to improve their use, there has been the generation of guidance documents and frameworks across regulatory agencies. So Duke University has established a real-world evidence collaborative, which informs on the current state of real-world data and real-world evidence uptake throughout the world. And as global interest from regulators has increased, this has led to discussion about the harmonization between terms like we just discussed, so that these can converge in guidance documents and best practices across the regulatory landscape. So the main goals of this collaborative are to engage stakeholders, to drive real-world evidence policy forward, and to provide comprehensive, and to inform regulatory agencies on the status of real-world evidence policy. The collaborative has various ongoing activities to help achieve these goals. They've developed numerous white papers and there's events. So I recommend that everyone kind of look into this because I think there's a lot of really good information out there. But one thing that we'll discuss today is the dashboard that they've developed as part of this collaborative. So this dashboard displays the current state of real-world data and real-world evidence uptake globally. So it allows users to track relevant guidance documents, frameworks, and standards. You can explore the different definitions between some of the key terms that we've already discussed. So it's interactive, and we will actually pull up an example of this in a few minutes. So currently there are 13 countries that have real-world evidence and real-world data published documents, and this is highlighted on the next slide. So we can just advance the slide. Great. So, like I said, there are currently 13 countries that have the real-world evidence, real-world data published documents, and they are listed here. So of these, we can go to the next slide. Great. So of these 13 countries and healthcare agencies that have documents, the US FDA has published the most relating to real-world data and real-world evidence. This includes 11 guidance documents and 1 framework. It's then followed by the EMA, Taiwan's FDA, Japan's PMDA, and China's NMPA. I would like to note that this slide, even since we finalized just a few days ago, is out of date since there was a finalization of a new guidance document. So the FDA just finalized the guidance document this month, real-world data, accessing electronic health records and medical claims data to support regulatory decision-making. And you'll actually see when I pull up the dashboard, in real time, the generation of this new finalized guidance is reflected on the dashboard. All right. So now I'm going to take the opportunity to share with you what this dashboard that I've been referencing. All right. So I think you might have to stop sharing so I can go ahead and share. I just got an error message. Great. So I just would like to kind of highlight this dashboard. So like I said, it's an interactive dashboard. You can actually access the guidance document through the links that are provided, and it lists the guidance documents and frameworks. So here is the interactive map, and you can select different countries. And like I said, the US now has 12 guidance documents and 1 framework. You can look at Health Canada, and as you click on different countries, the definitions of some of those key terms will come up. So you can see that this is not standardized just yet. Not every country is defining these, but if they are defined, you're able to click on the document where this definition came from. So I just think that this is a wonderful resource, and it is in real time. It's providing this data to the users. Also, like I said, from Duke's Collaborative, they have the dashboard, which we just accessed, but they also list all of the guidance documents across the regulatory agencies. And it is, this is just the final guidance I just discussed. So, showing that they're up to date, this guidance was just finalized this month, and there it is. They also provide the additional real-world evidence related documents based on the different agencies. So I recommend everyone to go check this out and continue to see how policy and documentation continues to evolve and change. So we can go back to our slides. Okay, great. So now we have an understanding, better understanding, hopefully, of not only the terminology used, but also the status of real-world data and real-world evidence uptake. I'd like to go on to just discuss some of the real-world data sources. So the FDA definition did list some of these sources, but they are so many sources. So I just would like to present some of these additional ones. So claims data was already introduced. These can be medical claims, prescription drug claims, Medicaid and insurance data, as well as billing data, clinical data from pragmatic studies and product and disease registries, patient-generated data, like much of the wearables we all have right now, and real-world data sources, such as the collection of electronic health records, administrative and medical claims databases. So to further elaborate on these data sources, we can go to the next slide. Here we are just providing some more details on specific examples of real-world data sources. So this was reproduced from Liu et al., and the specific examples here, I believe, really highlight how broad and potentially variable real-world data inputs can be. So when looking at the specific examples here, it's important to bring up one of the main topics associated with high-quality real-world data sources, and that is access. So the data is there, the data is being generated, but how do you get to use it and who is using it, I think is a really big question. So to access the data, yes, there is usually an associated cost. Again, I said usually there are some free databases, but let me tell you, big biopharmaceutical companies, they have realized the power of this data and they are spending the money to access it. So they're spending hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars to get access to these large data sets. And most of the time, the cost is associating with licensing. So according to a paper published by the American Society for Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, some of the costs of requiring license to this data can really vary. And I would just like to provide some data on this just to give this cost in context. So in the US, large claim data generally costs between $100K to $300K per license for each therapeutic area, and can be up to $1 million for all therapeutic areas. Structured electronic health record data can cost 1 to 3 million per therapeutic area, and unstructured data, so that data that's going to require much more extensive curation, can be 3 to 5 million per therapeutic area. Some of the sources that we are showing here, such as Medicare fee-for-service and specialty disease registries, they're not able to be readily licensed for direct access by biopharmaceutical companies. And so sometimes a third-party analysis is required. So there's an additional cost associated with that. And so sometimes these arrangements can cost up to $50,000 to $150,000, or even up to $1 million, depending on the type of analysis that's being conducted on these data sources. So there's also other resources, and we can go back to that one, just kind of finishing up on some of the other associated costs when accessing these data. So there's other resources that are needed. So you need personnel with advanced training in the field of study, data engineers and statistical programmers or data scientists who are capable of analyzing large amounts of data. And I'm just letting you know, it is now, as you probably are aware, very routine for large companies to invest millions of dollars in real-world data usage, and they have full teams that are doing this constantly. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So because of the characteristics of real world data, the nature of these data sources that we saw in the previous slide. The data generated is not always as straightforward or as clean as data generated from other sources, like a randomized controlled trial, an RCT. So this can lead to broad data sets that can be very messy and sometimes heterogeneous. And some of these characteristics can lead to some of the pitfalls of using real world data and some of the issues that can arise, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. So these data are collected outside of a controlled setting. So think of randomized controlled trial versus a real world evidence study. Like I said, there's a very high volume of data generated. So think about, your wearable. Multiple measurements are being taken, at any point, and that is just a continuously growing body of data. There is usually a lack of defined endpoints, specifically when, looking at registry data, and the format is not consistent across real-world data source types. And because of these characteristics, we can go to the next slide, these factors can impact the reliability and the relevance of the data. So just remember, those were two terms that we have previously discussed, which help to describe the overall data quality. So some of the pitfalls that can be seen that can impact reliability and relevance are, timing of assessments can vary in clinical practice. So there are not set assessment dates or times as we often see in RCTs. The selected measurements, labs, pathology, and imaging, which are used in clinical practice and research, is not always consistent. So there can lead to inconsistent data format as well as documentation. So there's not a standardized case report form to ensure that all data is collected and it's uniform. Missing and incomplete data is very common. Again, compared to RCTs, there aren't research coordinators who are consistently making sure that all assessments are completed. And there are protected health information requirements which must be followed. So, prior to sharing some types of data, there are methods that need to be applied to de-identify any identifiable data. Skilled analysis is required to identify the true data. So because of how voluminous these data are and what is being collected, they're not always constructed just to support that research question. So, you have to have a skilled team, which are some of the resources that I previously introduced, to be able to scrape what is the true data. So you think about, geographies with nationalized healthcare systems. These databases house all of this data, but data must be scraped before it can be correctly analyzed. And, teams are needed for this. All right. So because of some of these pitfalls, like I said, there can be big issues with data reliability and relevance. And so I'd like to try and provide some real world examples of when, real world data failed. So there's two examples here of papers being retracted from high impact journals. So this is from The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. So these two papers were published and they're related to the COVID-19 pandemic, published in 2020. Each of these papers used a multinational database of patient records compiled from hospitals around the world. But quickly after publication, questions arose about the data reliability and the data relevance, since the data source used could not be verified and it actually could not be accessed by independent auditors. So just to remind everyone, data reliability considers whether the data adequately represent the underlying medical concept, and data relevance assesses whether the data can address the research question. So because of these issues, both were retracted and statements from both journals were issued. As a result of these papers, as well as other papers, stricter standards have been included as part of the peer review process in journals like The Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine. So to keep out flawed studies like these, ones that are using large real-world data sets, they plan to include stricter standards for not only the expertise of peer reviewers, but they're also going to require that authors vouch for the validity of the data, and they must detail their data sharing plans. So they must state, before publication, if this data can be independently audited. So I just think that these are, great examples of, how there's so much powerful data out there, but when used incorrectly, it kind of sets everything back a couple of steps. So the potential pitfalls and challenges to real-world data always must be considered, but there are also significant advantages to using real-world data to generate real-world evidence. We can go on to the next slide. Okay, so often real-world evidence sources are compared to randomized controlled trials or RCTs. So compared to that, real-world evidence studies have less strict eligibility criteria. You're not selecting a specific group of patients, and it's more centered around clinical care. They require fewer resources and less time, and there are cost savings. But you have to remember, on the other side, there is a cost to not only generate real-world data or access real-world data, but also scrape and analyze that data. Patient recruitment is easier as these data are being collected as part of routine healthcare. So this can allow for higher reach in populations, such as pregnant women and children. Like I said before, large volume of data. So this can be a positive and it can also be a negative. So, in a positive sense, this can help facilitate with subpopulation analysis and better generalizability and modeling. And it allows for research regarding real-world patient behavior. So it's how the patient behaves outside of a strictly controlled trial. So we know that randomized controlled trials don't always give, the complete picture that we think they do. So, in the example of, let's say, safety, adverse effects often arise during clinical practice, which were not reported as part of these controlled trials. And so real-world evidence studies can provide an opportunity to identify some of these potential safety signals. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, sorry, I think I'm on a bit of a lag. So, I'd like to discuss how real-world data and real-world evidence is currently being used and leveraged in regulatory submissions. So traditionally, randomized controlled trials are used as the foundation for regulatory decision-making. I think, yeah, we can go back one. And that's referenced in clinical guidelines. It's also real-world evidence is being used to complement data generated from randomized controlled trials. So they're typically used to support a variety of regulatory submission types, such as initial INDs, media requests, study protocols, and final study reports submitted for INDs, BLAs, and NDAs. They can be used to support the safety and effectiveness for a product that's been not previously approved. They can also be used to support labeling changes for an approved product. And some of the ways that they do that are by adding or modifying an indication, changing the dosing regimen or route of administration, expanding the labeled indication of the product to a new population, adding comparative effectiveness information, adding or modifying safety information, or by proposing other labeling change. And these data have been used to support or satisfy a post-marketing requirement and commitment. So as you recall from one of the first slides, the primary regulatory purposes of real-world evidence in regulatory submissions in 2023 was to fulfill post-marketing requirements or post-marketing commitments. So I think those are the main uses right now, but we can go to the next slide. We're very early in the game, and regulations are evolving. This is how real-world evidence is currently being used now, but as the landscape continues to evolve, what's true today might not be true tomorrow. And so I think other uses as part of regulatory submissions are in development. And I would like to, challenge all of you to start thinking or identifying additional ways that real-world evidence can be used, or that we might see it being used in the future. Because I think this is an exciting time, as this landscape develops, access to these data sources is increasing, I think we're going to start to see it change and not only used to support data from randomized controlled trials. All right, we can go to the next slide. So when using real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory submissions, there is key information that is required to be included. So just wanted to highlight some of those things here. So purpose statement, including the rationale for real-world evidence and real-world data usage, identification of the relevant study. So, some of the relevant studies which might be used are randomized controlled trials that utilize real-world data to collect endpoints, including the use of real-world data to supplement a control arm, single-arm trials analyzed with an external control arm that relies on real-world data, and observational studies. So those are just some different study types. You must define the sources of real-world data. So where you're getting that data. Is it going to be electronic health record data, claims data, or any of the other sources that we've previously discussed? The FDA also stresses the importance of early engagement with the agency so that study design and data sources can be assessed and challenges can be identified. So the FDA is stressing this, but other regulatory agencies also want to have this interaction. Data access concerns should be addressed early on so that data can be made available and verified. Again, we saw the issue with those 2 retracted publications. The data was not available and could not be verified. And as part of regulatory submission, the applicant should also ensure you're following the applicable regulations related to protection of human subjects, IRB regulations, and ethics committee. And when applicants or sponsors are providing this level of detail in the submissions, there have been successful approvals. So I think on the next slide, we can just kind of highlight some of the instances where there have been successful drug approvals that have utilized real-world evidence. So you can see in this table here, this is reproduced from Dang et al., that real-world evidence is not a new phenomenon. This evidence has been part of regulatory submissions since at least 2017, and it just shows some examples. Again, this is not a comprehensive list of all drug approvals, but it's just kind of showing a nice snapshot with the compound or drug on the left, the type of real-world evidence used, to who was the real-world evidence submitted, dates, and then what regulatory action was supported by these. So I think it is just important to see that this is in process, it's evolving, and it will continue to develop. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So just to make some kind of conclusions here, I just, we've jotted some statements that we said, I hope that you can walk away from today with a better understanding of real-world data and real-world evidence. So the terms are being used inconsistently and interchangeably. So the data are, real-world data are data about patient health / healthcare routinely collected. And this can come from a variety of sources, but checking that, it's routinely collected, I think is the key. Real-world data is not new, but access is what is changing. And, I think access could be a whole discussion all on its own, not only the cost, but how to access, who owns this data, what needs to be done in order to make the data accessible, and just, what resources are being used to scrape the data so that it can be analyzed to drive real-world evidence forward. Real-world evidence is the evidence which is derived from the analysis of real-world data. These data sources are incredibly voluminous and generated at a very high frequency. And so because of some of these characteristics, variability is one of the main pitfalls that is seen with real-world data. They're typically used to date as supportive and supplemental data and regulatory submissions, but I do believe that we're going to see this landscape evolve and change. And I think it's going to be used in new and creative ways to bolster, support, and lead some submissions. So I think we can just pause there. I think we have covered everything that we had intended to cover today. And I think now if we want to pause and open it up to, any of the questions that might have either been submitted prior to or during this webinar.
Sounds great. Let's go ahead and move on to our Q&A portion of today's webinar. Friendly reminder, you are able to submit your questions using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the menu bar on your Zoom screen. We will do our best to get through as many as possible. If we do not get to yours, we will follow up with you after the webinar via email. That said, let's go ahead and move on to our first question. How can AI be used in collecting real-world evidence?
Okay, so this is a fun one. So I think, two of the main topics that I see, like the hot topics, AI and machine learning and real-world data and real-world evidence. So I think, whoever submitted this question, I appreciate it. And hopefully now, we might slightly alter this question. So hopefully we can all take away that we don't collect real-world evidence. We are collecting real-world data, and the evidence is then derived from that data. So while I wish I could claim that I'm an expert on AI, I am not. But knowing, the landscape of real-world data and real-world evidence, and having a solid understanding of AI, I could assume that there has to be applications of AI being used to scrape databases to get the relevant real-world data. Like I said, there's some of these really large data sets from nationalized healthcare databases, and I think that would be a great opportunity for AI to work. I can't give a specific example, but I'm sure that there are uses there. I also know that AI uses large data sets to learn and help develop algorithms. So I can only imagine that with all of these large data sets, AI is leveraging those for their development. I think this is an excellent question and part of a larger evolving field. So I think we might come back to this with some specific examples in the future.
Excellent. Moving on to our next question. Who should develop / write real-world evidence publications?
Okay. So I think, when you're talking about real-world evidence publications, you need to really think about, what is the topic? Is it just a, systematic analysis of real-world evidence, or is there a specified data analysis? So I think, accurately and very clearly defining the topic is what is going to drive this. But in general, I would say you need someone who is going to be very familiar with the data, so that has the skill set to develop and drive that project forward. So they know the data, they know what they need to scrape from the data, but you also need someone who can do the writing. And sometimes that's the same person, but oftentimes you need additional resources to help with the writing of these publications, and those who can address and supply the information that's required as part of the publications. So I think you have to look at the skill sets that are needed and the purpose of the publication. And as we saw just with those real world examples, you need to make sure that the data that's being used is fit for purpose, it's relevant, and it's valid in order to answer the specific question.
Excellent. Moving on to the next. All right, we've got a batch here. Please list the regulations to be followed when we use the data for direct submission or defending the submission. Which health agencies have accepted real-world studies as pivotal study and approved products solely based on RWD/RWE? And what is the acceptance of real-world evidence data by different agencies?
So I'm hoping that kind of throughout this presentation, some of these questions will have been answered. So the regulations for direct submission or defending submission. So I think right now it's important to highlight that the FDA has published a lot of guidance documents to help with real-world evidence submissions, but you also need to make sure that the data that's generated followed the applicable regulations, such as protection of human subjects. So I think I would, for these questions, which I think they're all kind of adequately grouped together. I think that, I would say to revisit that dashboard, all that information is very nicely included in one place. And so you can see, based on the regulatory agency, what guidance documents, what's frameworks, and the regulations are referenced within those guidance documents. So really kind of moving on to that second one about which health agencies accepted real world studies as pivotal studies. So off the top of my head, I can't give you a list. I hope that I gave some examples of specific submissions that real world evidence was used to support. And I think what we're seeing right now is real world evidence in general is being more used as, supportive data. I kind of challenge everyone, prove me wrong, find the example where it was solely based on, an approval was solely based on real world evidence. But off the top of my head, I wouldn't know that. But I think, if anyone finds that, that would be great. And, we can maybe share that data. And then the third question is, what is the acceptance of real world evidence data by different agencies? Again, I think, looking at the evolving real world data, real world evidence landscape that is shown on that dashboard, I think it shows where we are, and then also where regulations and regulatory authorities are going.
Wonderful. And I think we may have one more left. Question from the audience: can you speak more to the FDA's mindset in using real-world evidence to support post-marketing commitments and/or requirements?
Yeah, so I think, we were able to address this, whenever we talked, right now, real world evidence is mainly being used to support post-market commitments and or requirements. So I think that initial snapshot, right now, all of the, 14 submissions from 2023 were used. So I think, I can't speak for the FDA. I would say based on the data, which you always want to look at the data, I would say it's favorable. They are, accepting of real world evidence for these commitments and or requirements. And so I think, looking to see, next year, what are, the other submission types, I'm sure you're going to see that the main regulatory purposes were, post-marketing commitments and requirements, but will also be expanded. So I would say to answer this question, I think they're, would be favorable, but, and that's just based on the data.
Lovely. We have one more question, looks like. What are platforms, services, and processes to achieve real-world evidence integration?
So the platforms and services, I don't, that's not really my area of expertise. But I think, of this question, what I can address is really, how real-world evidence is integrated into overall data analysis. So everything begins with access to real-world data. So you need to access the data in order to create this real-world evidence. And so the evidence is going to be the conclusion that's drawn from this data. And I think that this, the evidence is woven into data from other clinical trials, which is analyzed separately, but then you can look at it as part of the larger data set. So I think what we're seeing is it's being used, as supportive data, integrated with data from other sources, such as randomized controlled trials, and, presented as a comprehensive data set. The specific platforms and services, like I said, I can't speak to, but we are seeing in the types of submissions, to regulatory agencies that, it is being used, integrated into some of these larger data sets that have used more traditional methods.
Wonderful. And that is going to conclude our Q&A session for today. We're going to try and give everybody 12 minutes back into their Wednesdays. We will stay on for another few minutes in case there are any last-minute questions that some people would like to ask. Also, as a reminder, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar in the coming days, so please keep an eye on your inbox for that. If you have any questions following, you can reply directly to that email, or you can feel free to send an email to consult@criterionedge.com. The email address and the links to reserve your free consult can be found in the chat. Once again, if you have any last-minute questions, we'll be on for a few more minutes to answer them. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.